Oh, hey, Jeannie.
Hey, Brew.
It's the holidays coming up and everything. And what I was wondering is, what do you get for the person who has everything?
I don't know what.
Antibiotics.
Our guest this morning is Iain Addleton. Good morning, Iain.
Hi, good morning to you both.
Iain is an associate at Synapse and fairly new, so we're really glad that you could join us this morning.
And I heard he's going to talk about offshore wind.
To start with, offshore wind is a booming industry on the U.S. East Coast, but it is kind of starting from almost a standstill. There's actually not that many turbines in the water currently, despite all the press that the industry and the resource gets. So this first slide shows some of the options that there might be in the future for connecting planned offshore wind turbines to the onshore grid so that electricity can be delivered to customers. There's a lot of different options. Almost all of the current projects are actually in the top left corner of the graphic, which is called a generator lead line approach. And in that scenario, every single project has its own dedicated offshore substation and infrastructure and line to the shore. So almost every US project to date is in that top left-hand corner. Looking ahead, the contrast to that is what's called a planned offshore transmission system or a network or mesh system, where there's a little bit more interconnections between the offshore wind farms. And as we'll go into, that has a number of different benefits. Europe is much farther ahead in terms of offshore wind. And depending on the country there, they use different versions of these models. And this is just a way of quickly conceiving of what's possible with offshore wind transmission. And to show that, even though we're in the top left corner in the US right now, there's actually a lot of other ways that we could build offshore transmission in the years ahead.
It seems like some of those other ways that are more complicated could be much more efficient, but then also present challenges in terms of planning and coordination. Who pays for it, who controls the design, who controls the transmission capability, and so on. Right? I mean, it seems like it could be complicated.
Yeah, for sure. A good rule of thumb is that the larger the scale and complexity of the system, the more the benefits increase, but certainly the more the policy challenges increase alongside that. So there's definitely hurdles to overcome. It requires a great deal of coordination to pursue any of these other options. But there's a lot of benefits attached to that process as well.
And you mentioned Europe. I'm wondering, do you know of any projects that involve multi-country coordination in Europe or elsewhere?
Yeah, so one term you might hear bandied about now is an offshore energy island. And I think in the Baltic Sea, especially kind of at the intersection of Scandinavia, Denmark, and northern Germany, there's some pretty cool projects that are starting to link large offshore wind resources in one place of the Baltic Sea to different countries all at once, where they can share transmission infrastructure, and it even makes things like operations and maintenance a little bit more cohesive as well.
In those examples, do you have, are there lessons learned that can be used in the States?
The interesting thing about the offshore wind industry in Europe is it predates the US industry by decades. So since 1990, the offshore wind industry in Europe has built about 22 gigawatts of capacity, the equivalent of thousands of turbines. The US goals for the next 15 years are about that level, between 20 and 25 gigawatts. So the US is trying to build just as much capacity as Europe in half the time. So there's certainly a reason to look to what they've done already and apply those lessons to the US East Coast as well. One of the lessons is that in Europe, they've kind of had a mix, depending on the country, of generator lead line projects or networked approaches. But in general, the trend is to move more and more to network transmission in Europe, even if that's not how they started. So that's something that maybe the US can skip the trial and error that came along with generator lead line approaches and go straight to the planned approach in the US.
Yeah, Max Chang was a guest on this show recently, and he talked about the scaling up and going from a few thousand megawatts to tens of thousands, and also the leapfrogging in terms of turbine sizes. That was interesting, right? So it's going skipping those little turbines and going right to the, 12 megawatts, 16. So we're learning from Europe in a variety of ways, right?
Yeah, and I think that the phasing is really important when you talk about offshore wind transmission. If we go to the second slide, actually, I've tried to capture the outlook for near, midterm, and long-term projections on the US East Coast. I took the idea for this graphic from a Brattle report on New York, and I just adjusted the figures to include New England, PJM, and the whole of US East Coast. So the first phase one, those are projects that are already contracted and have off-takers and they've been procured. Phase two are planned solicitations where we already know the schedule of when those solicitations will take place. And then looking out to phase three, those are a combination of state goals that have been set on the US East Coast. And you can see that if you total them up, there's somewhere on the order of 25 gigawatts. And the reason that I think this graphic is important to show is the first phase, that's already happening. And to some extent, transmission isn't much of a worry for that first phase. But as you move on and you increase the capacity, the need to really maximize interconnection points and have a planned transmission system increases. Actually, there was a very recent Business Network for Offshore Wind white paper that looked at this issue, and their kind of thesis was that transmission constraints are an existential threat, was the word they used, to offshore wind in the US because of what happens as you go from phase one to phase two to phase three, and the constraints that can happen if you're not planning out the transmission ahead of time.
Are those transmission constraints, are they kind of out on the water, or are they on the land side of, once it's in the grid, reinforcing the grid?
That's a really good question. A lot of the constraints actually happen once you get to shore. If you think about the lease area south of Massachusetts, if you do a generator lead line approach, the projects take the shortest distance to shore, which is maybe southern Cape Cod. And then that energy to get to a big load center like Boston has to go through a lot of other areas. If you take a planned approach, maybe the best system is actually to go around Cape Cod and go directly to the load center. And that happens in New York as well, with New York and Long Island. So you can really think about the interconnection points, the places where you can inject a lot of energy all at once, and maybe skip over some of the parts of the grid that need a lot of onshore upgrades. When you're talking about offshore, there are elements of constraints there as well. If you do a planned system, largely those systems are HVDC, which means higher capacity lines that are bundled together. And overall, that leads to less cables in the water and less miles of cables. And so that means you can maybe interact in a much more effective way with other maritime industries. And it's less disruptive both to the environment, maybe fishing grounds, and other industries that use the maritime environment as well.
Clearly some opportunities here, but some really big challenges, right? Because planning transmission for a generation that hasn't even been totally built yet, or may not even come online, seems like a big risk. But you're clearly enthusiastic about this. Can you talk about sort of either the most interesting or surprising things you've found in this?
One reason I think offshore wind is such a cool place to be is that you very rarely get the chance to design an optimal electricity system from scratch. Everything that happens onshore is built on decades of previous decisions and market rules and technology decisions that maybe aren't current with the fast pace of technology now. And that's not to say we shouldn't change things on the onshore grid, but it is sometimes a struggle to have layer after layer after layer of decision. When it comes to the offshore wind industry, it really is a blank slate to say right from the beginning, this is a pillar of decarbonization for state goals. And you can choose ahead of time with a clean slate the best way to do that in a way that expands the benefits to as many people as possible. If you look at decarbonization goals, in the US East Coast, you really need a combination of solar, storage, energy efficiency, and offshore wind. And it's hard to imagine meeting those goals without all four of those pillars being maximized. And so offshore wind is just part of the solution, but getting it right is very important. And if it's constrained by anything, whether it's permitting, transmission constraints, it's hard to see how states can reach some very ambitious and needed decarbonization goals.
So when Texas was adding all that transmission in order to get wind from the West Texas to the load centers, did they build the transmission ahead of time, and were they kind of working from a clean slate, as you said, or were they layering into an existing complicated system?
So the competitive renewable energy zones in Texas are often held up as an example for offshore wind. And the reason for that, it was similar. There was a very large wind resource that was known in West Texas. It wasn't really connected to the load centers in East Texas. So there was this big question, do you build the transmission to the resource area? Do you build the generation first and then build the transmission? And no one really knew how to solve that chicken or the egg problem. And so what Texas did is all at once, they planned everything together. They planned for the long term. They tried to get a very good sense of what areas project developers were interested in. And then they also did some very robust studies on what the grid needed to upgrade for that amount of energy. And then they ended up kind of allocating projects, allocating the costs across the entire ERCOT region. So they were spread out across a large rate base, and then building it all at the same time. And so Texas actually, their wind capacity has doubled or tripled since that project was started in 2005. I think most of the construction happened later on, 2008 to 2015. But it was a $7 billion project, but led to a very large wind resource being developed in Texas. And it's a good example of what happens if you kind of plan everything at once and think about the needs and where the generation might come from. One of the very interesting outcomes of CREZ in Texas is that ERCOT was presented with a range of options for their transmission system, and they didn't pick the least cost option or the highest capacity option. They picked a middle road option that started at a certain level of capacity, but was the most flexible for being built up later on to incorporate more capacity. So that's a great option for the offshore wind industry as well. If you've already started with generator lead line approaches, you can set those lines up to be networked later on and join a system that eventually takes place. So planning for transmission is across a very long time horizon. And there's a way of incorporating what we've already started into what eventually might be a network system that can move power to different interconnection points, is a little bit more reliable, leads to less onshore upgrades as well. And so that was an interesting decision by CREZ that actually probably makes a lot of sense for offshore wind as well.
There are planning solutions and ideas that might not really be in the interest of one company developing the project and selling their wind generated kilowatt hours, but might make a lot of sense for the kind of industry as a whole, or for the electricity customers in the region, or the grid in terms of reliability or overall long-term cost.
Yeah, the current setup is actually for the generator to pay for the transmission infrastructure they need, and even eventually some onshore upgrades as well. And so the analogy I've heard for that is it's as if you need a new highway and you make the last car to join the highway pay for the new lane, when the new lane benefits everybody. It decreases congestion, it decreases your commute time. So there's a lot of benefits to a network system. If you think about one line going to shore and that line going out, that's a big problem. If you have a network system that can move the power around to different interconnection points, there's a reliability aspect you get. Again, less onshore upgrades lead to less overall cost for the system. And then it also lets you incorporate phase 2 and phase 3 of offshore wind, rather than cutting those projects out of the picture entirely. So regional planning is important because it lets you really see the benefits across the entire system. PJM in November, actually, I think is the first balancing authority to really incorporate offshore transmission to their regional planning process. And that's what helps you get to a larger rate base to spread the costs around to a larger group of people who also benefit from a better planned and more cost-efficient system.
Have you been down there to see the wind turbines in Texas?
I lived in Texas for a year, actually, in West Texas in a town called San Angelo. So I've definitely driven past them.
Texas already had an economy that understood energy, so maybe this ramping up of wind was sort of enabled in part by people and one state legislature and political support for big energy.
I will say the comparison to offshore wind isn't perfect because Texas is a standalone region. And so FERC isn't necessarily involved and there's less interstate coordination. So it's not a perfect comparison, but it does show in broad strokes what it's like to build a planned transmission system from a standing start.
Right. Well, that's really cool. So this has been super interesting. Thank you for chatting with us today.
Yeah, it's good. Thanks, Ian.
Yeah, thank you both for your time and have a great Christmas and holiday season.
Thanks. You
too.
Bye.
Thanks for watching. This is Energy Nerd Show and Tell.
It's the show that we want to watch, so we're thinking maybe some of you energy nerds want to watch it too. If you do, then tell your friends and subscribe right around here. Click there.
And check
or there or over here.
Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and where else?
And the Energy Nerd website at energynerdshow.com. You can always go there. And if you want to be a guest, you can volunteer to be a guest. We love to have guests. In fact, that's kind of what the show is all about.
Absolutely.